music in a very kind of simple way. You can actually look at the back of this discrete music LP and make discrete music based on the diagram that's on the back.
It really is almost automatic music. It's Eno setting a system in motion and then standing back, and maybe making a couple little adjustments on the way, on the fly, but for the most part, just standing back. You know, it literally is a matter of getting a tape loop going, and then how many times are you going to loop that? How many times are you going to let it play?
Attractive, inquisitive, brilliant mind. There's a sort of serenity and calmness to it that just seems to be part of his personality, even when there's no words and there's no voice. Somehow, in a funny sort of way, even though it's meant to be emptying out his personality and almost be this music without any author, without any controlling self governing it.
Eno, I think deep down he's sort of a romantic, because you see underneath all of this aleatoric process and generative processes, you see decisions that are actually quite humanistic and warm. And so these intellectual decisions are then informed by what I think, as we see over the years, a beautiful sense of melancholy melody. And that permeates all of his best work. A very quiet, pacific kind of moodiness.
The creative approach to the first side of discrete music was not the only innovation on the release. As related in the sleeve notes accompanying the LP, back in January 1975, Eno had been knocked down by a taxi and rushed to hospital. While recovering from his various injuries, he was visited by ex-girlfriend Judy Nylon, who brought with her an album of harp music. The resultant listening experience, while watching the winter rain against his window, would lead him to formulate a new concept, and this concept he would term ambient music.
When he lies down, he realizes that he's put the record on such a low volume level that he can hardly hear it. And he decides to just lie there and experience that, again, accidentally, as a new way of experiencing music. Not only to experience it, but he proceeds to make 45 records to be listened to under similar kinds of circumstance, or not circumstance, but in a similar way, to the extent that the volume of the music you're listening to frequently falls below the threshold of audibility.
Sometimes a word can make a lot of difference, right? And it suddenly lights up what the phenomenon is. I mean, that phenomenon had been going on, the phenomenon of, like, music you could walk into and walk out of, right? Lamont was an example of that. And the other so-called minimalists later, right? Philip Glass and Steve Reich. I think Brian, when he stamped it ambient, then it suddenly lit up that idea and explained it in a simple way to other people. It wasn't so esoteric. It was more like, well, hey, we have dinner parties and we put on music and we're not listening to it, you know, second by second. It's like it's a kind of atmospherics. So it was a good idea, an interesting idea to, like, put those atmospherics as, hey, you're not supposed to be listening, right? You can do whatever you want here.
The concept was in fact far older than the work of the American minimalists. The French composer Erik Satie had, at the beginning of the 20th century, developed a similar notion of mood-enhancing background compositions he had termed furniture music. The concept and Satie's work had been revived later in the century by Eno's great inspiration, John Cage, who redefined even Satie's most famous piano pieces, the Gymnopédies, as furniture music, and a precursor to his own experimental work. Eno's concept of ambient music was a natural progression of this model.
Eno got an inspiration from Erik Satie and the idea of furniture music, music that was just kind of decor, you know, to your life, and it was something that kind of tinted the mood in your home environment. You could his idea was it had to be interesting enough that you could pay attention to it, but ignorable. You know, it had to have that capacity to drift back into the background, and that's a very opposite to rock kind of idea. Rock is supposed to sort of dominate your attention. It's supposed to leap out of the radio and sort of jazz you up with energy. And he was trying to look at all the other things music can be, which is something that calms you down, that sort of just is something you use to enhance your everyday life.
Satie put it in terms of music to have in the background in dinner when the silence between friends would kind of descend and you'd need something to fill in that uneasy gap, you know, sort of ambient dinner music. I think it's pretty much the same idea, and it's the idea of you want something to tint the atmosphere, not to be right in your face.
None of his music is ambient. It all immediately hooks your attention. It sounds simple, but it's not simple music. It is grade 8 classical music. It's hard to play. Where what Eno was looking for was the simplicity of the creation, the execution, and the result. Everything had to be absolutely simple. So in many ways, Eno was stripping Satie right down further, and actually achieving what Satie actually never achieved, because actually Satie used to play his music to entertain people. He used to make a living playing his music in bars and clubs, and people loved it. As interludes between more raucous stuff that would follow, but his music would be listened to. Where Eno, discrete music is so evanescent that you put it on and then you immediately do something else. It doesn't arrest your attention. What achieve with ambient is actually quite unique, actually. It's more akin to John Cage. I think as an idea it might have something to do with Satie, but in terms of music it has very little to do with Satie.
Having established both the Obscure Records label and the concept of ambient music, Eno immersed himself in collaborative work. The end of 1975 had seen the release of his second LP with Robert Fripp, Evening Star, which continued their experiments with tape delay and systems music. Eno laid low for the first few months of 1976 before re-emerging as part of a new ensemble, the 801, formed by Phil Manzanera as a short-term live outfit. The band, which included old Roxy cohort Lloyd Watson, played 2 explosive shows at the Queen Elizabeth Hall and the Reading Festival in the summer of 1976, performing not only cover versions of the Beatles and the Kinks, but also material from Eno's solo repertoire. And although the 801 would bring Eno back to the stage and to the more basic principles of rock and roll, he was still intent on pushing the boundaries elsewhere. And his next project would see him moving farther afield. Where the punk rock explosion was set to tear the music world apart later in 1976, both the mainstream and its margins had been conspicuously absent of experiment since Eno had gone solo. This was not the case, however, in Germany.